Chapter 1, Lecture 2 is going to look specifically at some of the aspects of the scientific method, the scientific process that you need to be familiar with to understand development. Before I go over that, I want to make sure to remind everyone that psychology is a science. And what that means is everything we're learning this semester, things I teach you, theories and concepts, come from following the scientific method, from doing research. So if you're unfamiliar with the scientific method, take a second to review this figure. What I want to focus on for a second here are the different methodologies that we often use in development. The goal here is to get as thorough an understanding of the developmental process as possible. Because of that, we rely on questionnaires or surveys that we give people, interviews where we sit down with someone and allow them to tell us a lot of information about whatever it is we're studying, observations where I might either secretly or knowingly sit somewhere and watch someone's behavior. For example, say I'm interested in how professional an emerging adult is when they start their new job. I might sit in their office on the first day of work and measure the different types of language they use. Observation often happens in either a naturalistic setting, so I'll go where something naturally occurs, or in lab, where I've created sort of a fake version of the atmosphere where something normally takes place. We also sometimes use something called ethnographic research, which is where a researcher will learn as much as they can about a specific culture and then involve themselves in that culture to understand as much about it as they can. Ethnographic research is similar to anthropology, if you're familiar with that field. We also use case studies, and a case study is what we call research that looks at a specific individual or a small number of individuals. For example, say you have a teenager who's gone through an experience that very few go through. An example of that could be a teenager who is a refugee who had to leave their country during war. That's not a common occurrence, or might not necessarily be a common occurrence in some populations. So we could take that individual and then measure as many things about their life, collect as much information about their life as possible. We, of course, also use biological measures. Yes, part of biology or part of psychology is our biology. We collect information about brain activity, hormones, chemical neurotransmitters in the brain, genetics information. All of this goes a long way towards helping us understand the foundation of development, which is, of course, biological processes. And then, of course, we do experiments. To refresh everyone's memory, an experiment is a study where we manipulate a variable. An experiment is not a correlational design. You're likely familiar with this, but as a reminder, a correlation is just a relationship between two variables, meaning as one variable changes, we tend to see the other variable change as well. That does not mean that one variable is causing the other. For example, I could say that as the amount of TV someone watches goes up, so does the degree of aggressive behavior they show. But unless I do an experiment, I cannot know for sure that watching TV is what caused a person to become more aggressive. In order to do that, I have to manipulate or change a variable. So say I have someone come into lab, I measure how aggressive they are before they do something, then I have them watch some TV, and then afterwards I measure how aggressive they are. If how aggressive that person is has changed after I manipulated or changed or did something to the participant, I can then say, hey, watching TV might be causing that aggressive behavior. I can assume causation. Of course, experiments are limited by many things, such as ethics. It's not always acceptable to manipulate people in certain ways, and even by nature. For example, we cannot manipulate gender, so we can never have a true experiment where gender is a primary or independent variable. There are two specific types of experiments I want to make sure that we are all familiar with because they are critical to the developmental study. The first is longitudinal research. This is where we track the same individuals over a period of time. For example, I study child A when they're 2, when they're 4, when they're 6, and when they're 8, the exact same child. I look to see what the developmental path or trajectory they take is over time. So imagine I'm doing a study looking at academic achievement in women. I might assess their GPA, their grades, their test scores when they're in 9th grade, the exact same women when they're in 12th grade, and then the exact same women again once they reach college. You may be wondering, hey, doesn't that take a long time? Yes, it does. Longitudinal research is not always possible, so sometimes we use something called cross-sectional research, where we can ask the same questions and try to establish a path or trajectory by looking at different individuals at different stages of development. For example, I study a group of 2-year-olds and look at, let's say, their attention span. I'll then find a similar as possible group of 6-year-olds and assess in the exact same way their attention, and then do the same for a different but similar group of 8-year-olds. Another example here, say once again, I'm looking at academic achievement in women. So I'm going to assess achievement in a specific group of 9th graders, a different group of 12th graders, and then another group of college students, all at the same time. Cross-sectional research can also help us establish a developmental trajectory. Each approach here has its own limitations and its own strengths. So sometimes we see researchers incorporating both, where we do a cross-sectional study to get a feel for what the trend looks like, and then over time we'll collect that longitudinal information as well. That brings me to the end of Chapter 1. If you have any questions, if you'd like to go over any of this content in more detail, or even just talk about it, feel free to reach out through email or during office hours.